For the election of 1808, Jefferson decides not to run for a second term because, again, of the precedent that George Washington had set in only serving 2 terms. So the next election, as you can see there, Madison will be elected. But the election of 1808 really is completely related to Jefferson, even though he isn't running. The opinion of most citizens of Jefferson is going to be reflected in who they elect. Jefferson was incredibly popular throughout most of the country, with the exception of New England. And James Madison had been Secretary of State under Jefferson, and that's something that we're going to see time and time again, at least in this early era, is that the people who are Secretary of State often are going to want to run for other political positions. Remember, James Madison, he was one of the writers of the Federalist Papers. He believed in strong government, but ultimately joins with Jefferson to create the Democratic Republicans. He thought the federal government was getting too powerful, and he wants to sort of bring back states' rights. So he is going to be running against Charles Pinckney, and we really see in this election how there can be sectionalism, how certain sections of the country vote one way or another. So again, New England really does not like Jefferson. Because of the embargoes and everything that he'd done, they disliked him. We see, though, that most of the country is voting for President Madison, or at least at that time, candidate Madison. When Madison becomes president, he is going to continue these very Jeffersonian ideas. He lets the bank charter lapse. In 1811, the charter for the National Bank was going to expire, and he decides not to renew it. So remember, Jefferson didn't want a national bank. He only agreed to it as part of that dinner table bargain so that the national capital would be located closer to his home state. And while Madison wants to continue improving debt the way Jefferson did, he wants to do that by essentially selling the bank, by selling the shares in the bank. But he doesn't want to raise taxes on the citizens. Another issue that we see during Madison's presidency is the effects of the embargo. So Madison essentially ends the embargo with the Non-Intercourse Act. And the Non-Intercourse Act says that all American shipping will continue, just not to Britain and France. And this is really kind of nonsensical because the only issues America had was with Britain or France at this time. So we're not fixing the problem at all. Then, as a way to try and fix the problem between the British and the French, or with the British and the French, we have Macon's Bill number 2 from 1810. The whole purpose was to stop Britain and France from taking American ships. This is during the Napoleonic Wars, and we kind of feel that we are stuck in the middle, even though we're trying to be neutral. So Macon's bill says that America is going to lift the embargo for 3 months. And if either country attacks, America will trade only with the opposite country. So essentially, whoever makes peace with us first, we will trade only with you. Napoleon sees the benefit of this, immediately agrees to neutrality, and the result of that is that Britain is pretty darn angry. So we see how the British are continuing to sort of abuse their power and their influence of the seas. And there's going to be a group of young congressmen called the War Hawks, because they were kind of calling to go to war with Britain. Most of these men were from either the South or the Western frontier, which makes sense, especially with some of the problems we'll talk about in just a moment. The most famous of these early war hawks is a man by the name of Henry Clay. He is from Kentucky, and really the reason why he particularly makes sense that he is one of these war hawks is his home state of Kentucky, because Kentucky is on the frontier, and there were plenty of issues with Indians on the frontier. Especially with Tecumseh there on the left, and then his brother, the Prophet, And they had sort of claimed that if all of these Indian tribes could work together, they would be able to defeat the whites. And the thing is, as these Indian tribes continue to sort of terrorize and plague the American settlers on the frontier, the Americans start questioning, where are they getting all these resources? And the guess is that maybe they are getting support from the British. So we have all of these different tribes possibly being supported by the British. The Americans really feel that this is encroaching on their neutrality and that Britain is overstepping the bounds. And things are going to come to a head with the Battle of Tippecanoe. This is going to be in sort of this frontier territory, and the main general is William Henry Harrison. And so he's going to fight against Tecumseh. And what we see with this battle is this. We're just using the Indians as a proxy. We are still having issues with Britain. And this will lead us to the War of 1812. So again, there's lots of buildup. This hasn't been something that just, happened overnight. It's been building over several years. The British were impressing, who were taking American sailors. The Indians who were attacking Americans on the frontier had been financially supported by the British and egged on by the British. And then we also have the financial issues of the embargo and how France agreed to sort of end the embargo with us first, so that makes Britain very, very angry. War is declared in June of 1812, which is why this war is called the War of 1812. Incredibly not clever at all. The problem with this, war has to be declared by the Senate, by Congress, and there were lots of divided opinions about this in Congress. And if you look at it, it has to do with going back to sort of these political affiliations. In the South, they are for the war. They are looking forward to trade being improved. They want to get those finished goods so they can focus on farming. And in the North, they really do not want war with England because they rely so heavily on trade with the British. The first real events of the War of 1812 are a bunch of riots in the city of Baltimore. And this starts because the people are upset. There were lots of immigrants living in Baltimore, people from France, from Germany, and they were very anti-British. So they sort of have all of this feeling, and there was a newspaper in town that was printing pro-British statements that, the government is too Jeffersonian, that they are too pro-France, and the only way to restore order and morality to America is to realign ourselves with Britain. So we really see the value of, or the importance of the printed word. The citizens of Baltimore actually sort of raid the printing office and are demonstrating what's important to the citizens and the power of the citizens. There are lots of little battles. We aren't really going to care about most of those little battles, but the general areas where these battles take place. First, we have up along the border with Canada. And this is the first goal of the Americans in this war, is to invade Canada, get as much land as possible. So they're sort of in what is Michigan today. Invade along Canada and on the western frontier as well. And there's two main reasons why this is important. The first is to get land, to get more land. We are greedy for territory, but also because the British are still in Canada. And remember, we thought that the British were supporting the Indians who were attacking civilians on the frontier. Then there are going to be several battles on the Great Lakes, actually naval battles, and because we don't live in a place with huge lakes, it's hard for us to imagine that you could put a navy onto a Great Lake, but that's exactly what happens in the War of 1812. The British Navy really isn't at full strength because they are also still fighting in the Napoleonic Wars over in Europe. When in 1814 Napoleon abdicates, a lot of those British forces are able to come to North America and fight us. So there was a real possibility that we were going to lose this war. Then we have a few engagements along the Atlantic coast, both economic and military. The British had attempted to blockade all transportation, trade, or otherwise on the Atlantic coast. And then one of the boats, the American boats that is going to interact with these British boats, the USS Constitution, it earns the nickname Old Ironsides. Even though she is entirely constructed from wood, she is so strong that some of the British cannonballs just bounced off, essentially. And then the fourth area where we see conflict is in the Chesapeake region. Once the British have more strength after the Napoleonic Wars end for them, they decide that they are going to invade. So first, they invade our capital city. Remember, it is a brand new city. It had only been established just a few years earlier. There's only 8,000 residents in the whole city. The British Army is 4,000 people. So the city is being vacated, and Dolly Madison was told by her husband, President Madison, that she needed to get out of the city. But before she does that, remember, she takes the portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart, because she realized that this is so important to our culture and to our story. So Dolly Madison, she's awesome. The British burn as many public buildings as they can in Washington, D.C. They really are just showing how angry they are, kind of that we even exist. They're still sore about losing the Revolutionary War. Then you can see they also move up to the port of Baltimore. And the fort protecting the harbor there is Fort McHenry. And it was bombarded for 26 hours, 26 solid hours of bombardment. And then in the morning, the bombing stops. And the men, and these were sort of militiamen who were in the fort. That silence was truly ominous because they didn't know, did it mean that the British were invading on foot? Did it mean that the British were retreating? They had no idea. When they found out that in fact the British had decided to give up, that this was not worth their time and energy, the Americans inside Fort McHenry were so relieved. And for that morning's sort of flag ceremony, they raise a giant flag, which was seen in the harbor by a young lawyer who was negotiating a soldier's release. And he wrote a poem about the Star-Spangled Banner. And so this flag, this is what inspired our national anthem. After this point, when the British are retreating, they decide they are just going to make their way back to some home territory. In this case, they want to get to Jamaica, but they're going to have to sort of refuel along the way, and we'll see what happens later in New Orleans on their way to Jamaica.